The Triathlon Show 293. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Andy Blow. Andy is the founder of Precision Hydration, and as long-time listeners will know, he has been a guest on the podcast several times before, and he's back now for an update on similar topics as we have discussed previously, namely hydration and nutrition, and in particular for racing. But a new angle that we take in this interview is the work that Andy and Precision Hydration have done with pro athletes in helping them, consulting with them, and getting to see all their data before and after the race in terms of what their race nutrition plan was and race hydration plan was, and then what the actual execution was. And we start the interview by, from that perspective, discovering what are the current best practices used by some of the fastest athletes in the sport of triathlon and outside of triathlon as well, for that matter. But before we get into the interview with Andy, big thanks to our sponsors, and the Precision Hydration is one of the sponsors of this episode. For very long time listeners, you'll know that Precision Hydration was the first sponsor that came on board with that triathlon show. So huge thank you to them for sticking with the podcast for so long. It's really fantastic to have such a great long-term relationship. I just want to quickly highlight two things that Andy will mention later in the interview, two resources that you can make use of from Precision Hydration to help get your race nutrition and hydration plan up to the best possible level that you can get it. One is their new resource, the Quick Carb Calculator, with which you can calculate how much carbohydrate that you should take in racing or in training. And if you want to have a free consultation with a hydration and nutrition expert, then book a free consultation on the Precision Hydration website. I have links to that in the show notes as well. And of course, if you want to buy any Precision Hydration products, use the promo code THATTriathlonshow15 to get 15% off. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Roka are the world-leading manufacturers of wetsuits, dry suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses. Whether you're looking to go faster in the open water, get more performance and aerodynamics out of your tri-suit, or find a perfect pair of eyeglasses that combines function, comfort, and design, Roka have an option for you based on exceptional R&D and attention to every single detail in any product category. Personally, I use many Roka products, from the Maverick XT wetsuit to the Rory prescription glasses, and all of them I consider really top-notch products that I absolutely love using. Really amazing products. You can get 20% off your Roka order with the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Andy Blow. Welcome back to the Triathlon Show, Andy. How are you doing today?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Michael. How are you?
I'm good as well, thank you. For the listeners that may not know who you are, it's been a bit of a time since you've last been on. Can you give an introduction to who you are and your background in endurance sports?
Definitely, yeah. My name's Andy Blow. I'm the founder, CEO of Precision Hydration. Like many of your listeners, I used to be a pretty serious triathlete. Luckily I've recovered now though, so I'm getting better. I learned a lot about hydration and a bit about nutrition and fueling from doing the sport myself, and often through making a lot of mistakes, and particularly around the hydration side. That was the catalyst for me getting into hydration as a sort of concept, and then eventually growing a business out of that. Precision Hydration have been in business for 10 years now. Although we work across a lot of different sporting disciplines and sporting codes across the world, we work with baseball teams and American football teams, soccer teams in the Premier League and stuff. Our sort of heart is with endurance, and in particular with multisport. So that's the kind of background that a lot of the team comes from. And we enjoy working with a lot of triathletes and multisport athletes around the world to this day.
Yeah, and that's something that I want to get into in today's topic. The athletes that you've been working with, because basically we planned on maybe going through some case studies with some of the top athletes that you have been working together with and helping them develop their nutrition and hydration strategies. So perhaps you can start by discussing what sort of relationships you have with these athletes and how you generally help them with these strategies.
Yeah, so I think the way, as a company, as a brand, the way that we work with professional athletes is perhaps a little bit different to the way many companies do. The relationships that we have with athletes, if they end up being sponsored or being ambassadors for us, tends to start with them making contact with us because they feel like they've got a problem in hydration or fueling or both, which they want to solve, and we tend to jump in and try our best to help them to solve that problem and kind of, get them on track with their hydration and nutrition intake for races. And that often is the catalyst for a further conversation then about whether they would like to represent the brand. So it's not really the way that we sort of don't sit around strategically thinking who would we like to represent our brand and then go out and reach out to them. I mean, sometimes we are quite proactive in the conversations we have with people, but generally the relationships with athletes are around performance first and then about sponsorship later. So we've had a lot of conversations with a lot of athletes over the years, many of which don't turn into sponsorship arrangements, but some of which do. And they're the ones that people visibly see above the line. And usually we tend to try to be very clear on what our lane is. And our lane has been to a large extent hydration and helping with hydration strategies that inevitably is crossed over with conversations about fueling, but we don't stray outside of the kind of exercise window too much. So we don't try to give general day-to-day nutrition advice. That is a completely separate professional domain. We're very focused on what people eat and drink immediately before and during and potentially immediately after hard training sessions and races to get the maximum performance in that short window.
Yeah. So when you work with athletes in this capacity, and let's discuss racing perhaps in this context, what do you help them with when you create the hydration and fueling plan? What are the things that go into the plan in the first place?
Over the years, the plans have actually been simplified. We used to start to look at them from all sorts of different angles, but what we boiled it down to in the end is something which we've kind of, I guess, coined the phrase of the three levers that you can pull in terms of fueling and hydration during a race is, and the most impactful levers to pull are how much fluid to take, how much sodium to take, and how much carbohydrate to take. And those three fundamentals are what we try to focus on. So when we work out a hydration plan with an athlete, it will be focused around their total sweat loss, their total sodium loss, and then how much of that potentially needs replacing. And with the fueling, the carbohydrate planning, it's about how much carbohydrate is optimal and how much they can tolerate per hour, and then how to meet those three needs in the most simple way as possible. So the approach is about writing a plan or working with the athlete to come up with a plan before a race, which is usually put into a very simple spreadsheet, looking at then what products they're going to use to implement that plan. And then immediately after the race, doing a debrief where we gather as much detailed information as we can about what they actually consumed so that we can then break it down into liters of water, milligrams of sodium, grams of carbohydrate, how that was spread out across the race, comparing it with the weather conditions, comparing it with their perceived performance level, and comparing it with any perception of GI distress or lack of. And then that kind of goes into our database with that athlete to say, all right, well, moving on from there, how does what they were planning to do and what they did compare? How does all of that compare with what we would consider to be scientifically rigorous or like textbook guidelines? And then what might push us to keep that the same or change 1, 2, or 3 aspects of it?
At what point, how long before the race would you typically sit down and create the strategy?
Ideally, you'd be close enough to the race that the athlete is focused on it, but far enough away that they're not caught up in the minutiae of the travel and the stuff before it. So usually it's about a week out, I would say. That's about optimal depending on their schedule.
And what about training your nutrition and hydration strategy? Is that something that we definitely see work with there? They kind of know what they're going to be doing, so they have already been practicing something very similar to what they will be doing in racing. Is that how it works, or?
In an ideal world, it does, yes. Like the key training sessions in triathlon terms, the big brick sessions or the fast brick sessions are the ones where we encourage an element of simulation of the nutrition plan using identical products, using identical strategies. The only time that becomes tricky is when someone's training in environmental conditions that could be vastly different to the race, in which case you kind of have to, you can't hydrate as if you were training for Hawaii if you're training in cool conditions, because you would just overdrink, for example. So you kind of have to make allowances. But as much as possible, we try to encourage like 1 or 2 sessions a week in the last few weeks that really simulate what you do on race day, just to flush out any problems with it.
Yeah. So if we discuss some commonalities of what these athletes that you're working with, what they're doing in terms of their hydration and their nutrition, what are the things that you tend to see that they do in a very similar way? Are there some variables where they fall in a pretty narrow range and some others where they're quite widespread? Can you discuss that a bit?
Yeah, I think for definite, where you see the widest ranges are both within an individual and between individuals are in the fluid consumption levels. So we will see in cool conditions, even in quite a long race, we can see athletes drinking as little as 200 or 300 milliliters of fluid per hour. And that same athlete or even a different athlete might drink 1 liter per hour during a much, much hotter and more humid event of the same relative intensity. So the bandwidth for the amount of fluid that you take in is really, really high. And that is pretty obviously driven by your overall sweat rate, which is usually a combination of intensity and environment. So the hotter it is, the faster you're going, the more you're going to need to drink in order to compensate for sweat losses. And of course, individual sweat rate comes into that as well, because some people do just sweat more than others. So there's a pretty wide bandwidth there, and hand in hand with that comes the sodium recommendation, because we know that some athletes sweat a lot, and we know that they lose relatively small amounts of sodium in that sweat. Other athletes might sweat a lot and lose loads of sodium in that sweat. So the amount of sodium tends to be proportional to the amount of sweat that's lost overall, but also a little bit individualized, or actually sometimes quite a lot individualized to the athlete. There's a bit of trial and error involved with both of those too. When it comes to the fueling element, the carbohydrate consumption, I would say that there's still a reasonable amount of variance between athletes, but less variance overall, partly because the numbers in terms of grams of carb per hour that work for athletes or are scientifically proven to work for athletes seems to be there's a lot more consensus around that. And I think it's something that I've seen in the last 4 or 5 years has been talked about a lot more in terms of athletes aiming to consume a little bit more carbohydrate. So we've tended to see at the sharp end of races, the professionals and elite athletes that we're working with, there's a trend for them to be eating quite a high amount of carbohydrate in a slightly narrower band than you would say, like the difference. You're not going to get someone, I don't think, you might see someone drinking 3 times as much fluid as another person. It would be rare to see someone eating 3 times as much carbohydrate.
What would that carbohydrate bandwidth be, for example, if we're talking about half-distance triathlons?
For a 70.3 kind of distance, we would be advising a lot of athletes to, if we had no prior information on them, we would start with something, between 60 and 90 grams of carb per hour over the duration of the bike and run, with those numbers probably loaded up a bit more heavily on the bike to allow for the fact that you'd take less on the run. And but what we're also seeing is there are a number of athletes who would go a little bit beyond that. So maybe up to 100, even 120 grams carbohydrate per hour in that period. So it's kind of, I would say there are probably a few athletes who get away with a little bit less than 60 grams an hour. I've even seen 45, 50 grams an hour for people who are doing really quite well in the races. But the question mark for me on those is not whether, you can't argue that it is sufficient if they do well, if they meet their goals in the race, but it's more like, okay, well, could more have unlocked a bit more performance, or maybe enhanced recovery or something like that. So that's the zone, I would say, that we're talking about.
Yeah. What about if we go to full distance? Do you see a trend to slightly higher intakes there?
I think aspirationally, there's definitely a trend to taking more, as in people's plans often incorporate more, but it's also it's trickier to hit those numbers hour after hour after hour in a long race, especially if things don't go your way, because even professional athletes are emotionally driven. And if your race isn't going brilliantly, it can be tempting for your head to drop a little bit and for you to take your eye off the ball when it comes to like really keeping on top of fueling and those sort of things. So I would say that when it goes well for people and when people are really smashing it, they tend to be hyper alert to keeping their pace up and their fueling up together. And so you see that being able to be maintained. When races don't go so well, it's often can be a little bit difficult to unpick whether the fueling levels or the hydration intake or whatever has dropped because that's caused a drop in performance, or whether a drop in performance has kind of happened, and as a result, the athlete has kind of lost a bit of interest and isn't fueling as well. You see what I mean? So that's why a bit of a subjective debrief after the race is often really important to kind of contextualize the numbers that you see.
Yeah, and I don't know, are you working with any short course athletes on the Olympic distance? Sprint distance, you probably don't really need much, if anything, but Olympic distance, are you working with any athletes on that distance?
One or two, and we have a few athletes that kind of straddle, that maybe do the 70.3 distance and are transitioning up from shorter distance. We're working with a couple of marathon runners as well. So for those athletes, they have a bit more. I think there's an advantage to fueling in a 2-hour race. I actually didn't used to fuel sometimes in Olympic distance triathlons back 20 odd years ago, and I think that was quite typical. Maybe just had a bit of water on the bike or something. Gels, people were starting to take gels on the bike, and now I would say the average there is that most Olympic distance athletes that we see will try to take 1, if not 2 gels on the bike. So sort of like that would be 40 to 60 odd grams of carbohydrate probably if they're taking 2 gels, and perhaps even carry one on the start of the run. But whether they can get that down them or not depends on the pace and how they're feeling. Yep. So there's definitely a move towards that. Also with the drinking, maybe a carbohydrate drink on the bike to meet the fueling and hydration needs if it's hot is also a pretty common strategy.
And what about running? You mentioned marathon running. What are the trends you see there with carbohydrates?
A lot of people, obviously, Morton is a big name in the field of fueling for marathons because they've got very high carbohydrate drinks. They've brought out some gels as well. So I think they've helped with because in Morton, you have to tip your hat to their marketing and their sort of outreach, and they've done a great job in highlighting the fact that a lot of these elite marathon runners are aiming for very high carbohydrate consumptions. And so we've had more conversations with athletes about fueling through liquids and that, because I think fueling with liquids can make a lot of sense in a marathon if you're running fast, because it's far more easier and digestible than getting a gel down and then having to chase it with some water. I think you can do both. I think fueling with gels in a marathon has a massive case when it's cold conditions because you don't want to drink the volume of fluid. But I would say marathon runners are probably, like the rest of the endurance run, are kind of getting swept along with the idea that actually the old school mentality of like running a bit lean and taking as little calories as possible is becoming superseded by the attitude of actually, if I can get more in without GI distress, then I will take more. And so people are talking about gut training and all these kind of things, which wasn't so much on the agenda 10 years ago.
Yeah. What are your recommendations when it comes to running? Let's say if somebody's aiming to run a marathon between 3 and 4 hours, what would you recommend if you don't have any much other information about them?
if they're pushing pretty hard, if that's a high intensity for them, to run 3 or 4 hours, if that's like they're going for a PB, then we're sort of in the 60 grams an hour carbohydrate range, I would say, as an aspirational number to try to get in. And for elite runners, obviously elite runners wouldn't be running those times, but for elite runners, they have it a little bit easier because they can probably pick up water bottles and gels every 5K with their own plan. For other people, that's where like carrying some gels for some of that duration, depending on what's available on course, actually becomes a good halfway house. And practicing fueling on their longer training runs, what would be like the typical long Sunday morning run. There was a definite trend a few years ago for people to want to do those runs fasted and run on as little carbohydrate as they could to improve fat burning. But I think the trend is more coming back towards people realizing that actually you can keep a higher intensity, you can recover faster, and it's more simulation for your gut for race day if you fuel during those runs, in which case carrying a handful of gels with you is a small weight penalty that actually results in an overall performance gain.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to sodium, one question that I also wanted to ask is whether the athletes that you work with have done a specific sweat test that you offer with through your partners with a medical grade device, or whether they are more so estimating, perhaps with the help of your sweat test or just trial and error in training. How do they come up with their sodium numbers?
Good question. Mostly we get them with proper sweat tests where it's humanly possible. The COVID year has tested that a little bit because we have been working with athletes who weren't able to access a test, in which case we would have far more in-depth conversation with them about past experience and getting them to do our online test and really trying to drill down into the best guess we could make before we can get them tested. But we always like to know the hard numbers if we can. So I would say with pro athletes, it's like 9 times out of 10, it's with a proper sweat test, and they're usually very keen to do that. We often send them a spreadsheet as well to gather some sweat rate data through a variety of training sessions. And you and I have talked about the value of measuring your sweat rate in the past, and I'm still a big believer in that because the range that we see of like of an individual, what is heavy sweat loss for an individual can be quite wide. Some people, when they're sweating a lot, may be sweating 1 liter an hour. Some people may be sweating 3 liters an hour when they're sweating a lot. And it's just useful to calibrate the thinking around whether that person is a 1 liter an hour, a 2 liter an hour, a 3 liter an hour person, because it affects how aggressively you look at sodium and fluid replacement.
Yeah. And in terms of the format of the energy consumed with the athletes you work with, is that something where you see any commonalities, or are they different? Again, whether they use sports drinks or gels or bars or something else, how do you see that trend going? And if we're talking about triathlon specifically here, we can return to that arena.
Yeah, for triathlon, I would say that gels are the king for most people. I think that's because they are the most versatile of all the energy products. At a push, you can eat most gels without liquid or without liquid immediately, but they're very light and portable. They contain a very measurable dose. And certainly for Olympic and half Ironman distance, if you're racing hard, gels are still quite easy to suck down when you're breathing hard. So they sort of make sense for that. Once the distances get longer, though, and even for a lot of people doing a half distance or certainly a full distance at a more moderate pace, people start to like to introduce more solid food and sort of like the chews and gummies and the bars and that kind of thing, and even some like other real foods in special needs bags, like bananas or your favorite Snickers bar or whatever it happens to be, can be advantageous because eating for 5, 6, 7 hours on the bike is very monotonous and can get quite sickly, whatever the gel or product is that you use. And although I think from a pure physiological performance point of view, it's very possible to do an entire Ironman on gels, it's not pleasant for most people. So most people appreciate having something to chew on, having a different flavor and whatnot. But and I would say like the other thing to bear in mind is that it sort of changes based on your level of output, because if you're trying to get 90 to 100 grams of carbohydrate in an hour, that's quite a big task with energy bars, the amount of chewing and digesting and stuff you've got to do. Whereas if you're down at the sort of 50 to 60 grams an hour, then a combination of energy bars with some other stuff is far more feasible. But you're not going to get the guys that are trying to do 120 grams an hour to sort of smash that in energy bars. They would just be chewing constantly for the whole hour.
Yeah. When it comes to the Ironman, for example, how many of the pros you've been working with as a proportion would you say are trying to do it using only gels, or maybe gels and sports drinks, or kind of very simple, easy to use sports nutrition products, not caring about the variation in what they take in, versus the proportion that might want to have a bar or something, even something more real food like in there at some point?
I'd say it's unusual to find any, even pros that won't take any bars and stuff during an Ironman. There definitely are out there, but in most of the conversations we have with people, even if they're slurping down gels for most of it, they kind of have 1 or 2 bars to look forward to, or something to change it up. So I would say almost everyone that we're working with has got an element of solid food in their plan, and a lot of that, in my view, is as much psychological as anything else. But that's still very valid.
Yeah. And do they tend to be completely self-sufficient, having all their energy with them and available through special needs bags and so on? Or are they also relying on getting, for example, a lot of the Ironman races provide Gatorade or similar? How many people use that as part of their fueling strategy versus being completely self-sufficient?
I don't know many people who are entirely self-sufficient. Most of them will grab stuff from the aid stations, and that'll be a mixture of like the sports drinks that are available, water, obviously, for tipping over their head, and maybe chasing down some electrolyte capsules with special needs bags occasionally. But we all know that even for the pros, there's no guarantee you'll actually get your hands on them depending on what happens. So I think most pro athletes have raced enough in enough different places to know that they are going to have to rely on a proportion of aid station stuff. And also they're not going to wait, although they will carry a good amount with them from the start, especially if it's, say, a hilly course or something like that, they're going to factor in the idea that they don't want to have too much weight on their bike or in their pockets. So most of them are open to the idea of, picking up some gels and things that are on the course.
Yeah. When you do the debrief after the fact, and in those situations when the athlete felt that, well, something did go wrong, and you come to the conclusion that, well, something with either hydration or nutrition was probably what was at fault, or at least partially at fault, what are the most common specific issues that you see in those situations?
Most common, I don't know what would actually. I don't know what I would put my finger on and say what's most common, because they are often very individual. I would say when environmental conditions don't meet the pre-race expectations, when people have got in their heads that maybe a race was going to be quite hot, and even if we all see the forecast, but there are certain places which are kind of known in your head as hot, and then if it ends up being uncharacteristically cool on the day, you might see people overdrink still, because in their head they had prioritized hydration. It's kind of hard to take that out. The other one is like being caught up in the racing. If the race becomes extremely tactical or doesn't go to plan, like, for example, you were down in the swim and had to chase a lot harder on the bike, then maybe there are gaps of time when fueling isn't at the high levels that you wanted it to be at, and then there's no opportunity to catch it up, so you end up with holes in the plan. When we first start working with people, and this is not probably true at the higher end with the pros, but can be with sort of the more elite amateur athletes, I would say one of the most common ones is just like underfueling the bike, probably. If you wanted to, and in fact, if you wanted to pick up one trend overall, it's that as obvious as it might seem when you break it down, I don't think it's obvious to everyone that in a triathlon, even though you've got more time on the bike, proportionally per hour, you probably need to be fueling quite a bit more than you will on the run. So if you were planning to take 60 grams of carbs per hour through the race, you're going to need to be doing 70 or 80 an hour on the bike, because on the run you just cannot get as many calories in without stopping too often.
And I think the swim is important to take into consideration here as well, because I tend to advise athletes to start their fueling 10 minutes before the race start or 15 minutes before the race start with one gel, and they can count that as kind of their in-race nutrition.
Agreed.
But then you go through the swim, and especially for an Ironman, obviously, it is a very long one. But even for a half Ironman, it is still, well, if you're a fast swimmer, it can be 25 minutes or so of just being kind of on the rivet. Or if you're a slightly slower swimmer, it can be 35, 40, 45 minutes of still probably, I think most amateur swimmers use a lot of carbohydrate in the swim because they're not very efficient and haven't developed the swim as much, don't have that same volume and aerobic capacity. So I think we tend as a population of triathletes to underestimate maybe the impact of the swim there, and you need to kind of make up for that on the bike as well.
Yeah, that's true. And I think your point is definitely a good one, that, you might be burning a lot of calories as a fast swimmer at the front, but you're probably also burning a lot of calories as an inefficient swimmer doing a 40-minute half Ironman swim. And also you've got a load of adrenaline coursing through your veins, and adrenaline unlocks glucose into the bloodstream and increases uptake of glucose. So you are actually, because you're in a fight or flight mode, your body is like primed to burn a load of fuel. And I definitely think, although it makes sense to let your stomach and your heart rate settle a little bit on the bike before you really start ramming things in, you could, within reason, it's a bit of a broad sweeping statement, but within reason, I don't think you can start fueling too early on the bike. I think as long as you can tolerate it, it's good to start topping up straight away, because by the time you feel your blood sugar start to drop, or you feel a bit of a hunger or something, you really are probably a long way eaten into your energy stores.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's discuss the amount of carbohydrates in a bit more detail. So you have mentioned here that some of the ranges that you're working with for a half distance, you mentioned 60 to 90 as a typical range, but with some people, maybe especially pros, pushing the higher end of that, 100, 110 even. And that's something that I've been experimenting with as well in training and in a couple of races, getting to that high end, and it's been working well, I think. So, but before we go into that high end, just generally speaking, with the 60 to 90 grams, how do you know whether it's 60 or 90? Because that's still a bit of a difference. And what are the moderating factors for where you should be in that recommended range?
Yeah. So, the recommendation, the 60 gram figure used to come from the fact that in the lab it's been measured that the uptake of glucose is a maximum for most people is around about 60 grams an hour. So you can consume and transport from your gut into your bloodstream around about 60 grams of carbohydrate an hour. And it was thought for a long time that represented a bit of an upper limit of what you could probably tolerate during exercise. And then researchers like Asker Jukendrup was one of the major ones who looked into this in the early 2000s, was saying, well, actually elite athletes routinely appear to be consuming more than 60 grams of carbohydrate an hour, absorbing it, presumably tolerating it, and it's helping their performance. How is that? And the 90 gram figure came about because they found that if you put fructose in with glucose, you can use different transporters in the gut and absorb about 30 grams of fructose per hour, allegedly. And then that gives you kind of 90 grams. So that became like a new scientifically proven, if you like, upper ceiling. And that sort of 60 to 90 gram window, it also, for a lot of athletes, it kind of, the lower end of that, around 60 grams an hour, seems to coincide with the habits of what a lot of people do. So, for example, drink one bottle of sports drink plus take an energy gel is going to give you something in the region, depending what you're using, of around about 60 grams of carbohydrate, for example. And so that's kind of in people's compass. And going beyond that, up to 90, starts to take not only a bit more proactivity, but it takes a bit more confidence and a bit more practice, because obviously, as we know, when you exercise, you get less blood flow to the gut. It becomes harder for the body to absorb stuff generally. And I think people, especially if they've had gut problems before, become a bit worried about trying to push it up to 90 or whatever. So we use that window when we're talking to people, saying, look, 60 to 90, it is quite a wide window. But the idea is that, look, if you're not at 60 yet, let's try and nudge you up towards that. And if you're at 60 or a little bit more, let's see if we can go a little bit beyond that and start getting up to 90. Because we see that with some people it's possible. And we're not talking necessarily, I think it used to be thought that it was a minority of people that it's possible with. But I think my view has shifted, that it's not a minority of people who can do it. It's just that it's a minority of people who find it easy to do that out of the gates. I think for some of us, it requires a bit of persistent effort to get up towards 90 grams. And that's where this concept of like training the gut, as it's called, comes in, which is challenging the gut with a little bit more carbohydrate progressively. Does that allow it to adapt? And I think although there's not been tons of scientific evidence produced on this yet, there are a lot of credible people in the field. There are a lot of athlete case studies out there that suggest that actually, this is something which you can build up to.
Yeah, let's get into that in a little bit more detail in just a minute. But before we do that, so what about the going beyond 90 grams? What is the evidence for that being feasible or even advisable, going to 100, 110, 120 grams per
hour? I think honestly, it started out with the way most of these things do, whereby, let's say in marathon running, it was widely recognized that, say, running 100 miles a week is like really an optimal level for performance. It feels like a nice round number, and people doing that. And then there's always going to be a guy who goes out there and runs 150 miles a week and can do it and then wins a race or something. And then, so I think what happened first of all is that people who are working with elite athletes noticed that some of them were eating considerably more, because often athletes know their bodies, they work instinctively, and they eat more, and if they find a trick that helps them perform better, they will repeat that trick. That's how things get established. And so elite athletes started eating more, or maybe they've been eating more for a very long time and just no one was counting, but there's a precedent for it, and then researchers start to cotton onto it. And there's a guy that you've had on the show before, I think, Aitor
Morales,
and he's done for research from Spain, who's done research particularly in ultra running and cycling, because he's worked with Astana and people like that. 120 grams an hour, he's saying, is like, we got plenty of athletes can do that. When we do it to a group, some people get gut problems with it, but a good proportion don't. And those that don't, they see less muscle damage, they see improved performance. So it's becoming more widely accepted that, look, if you can do a little bit more, it's probably not got a serious downside unless it gives you GI distress, and it's got an upside, because at the end of the day, you're burning a lot of energy. You're going to burn through a lot more energy than you've got stored in your muscles during a long distance triathlon. Presumably, if you can process more external or exogenous fuel throughout that time period, you spare your muscle glycogen better, and you have more left at the end, which results in less of a drop off in performance. So it is one of those rare cases where almost it's not. It is. I hate sweeping statements, but it's close to being one of those occasions when you can say, "Yeah, do you know what? More is better."
Mm. And do you see a lot of athletes that try to get to those really high levels, even in half distance triathlons, or is it mostly full distance, or are they kind of similar? Because, as you say, you might have aspirational goals to go higher in the full distance, but actually, in practical terms, maybe the difference isn't so big.
Yeah, I'd say from the actual hard evidence that I've seen with athletes we've worked with, it has been more in the long distances, because I think it's still filtering down. Although I've read anecdotal reports from other people, like there's one floating around from Gustav Eden from Daytona, that he was taking like 130 grams an hour on the bike or something like that in that race. And we've worked with a couple of athletes who were racing at the front in that race who were taking like 90 to 100 grams an hour. So I can well believe that other people were maybe able to do a little bit more. I think the difference is, though, in a shorter race like a half Ironman, when you're very, very well conditioned, you can get away with a bit leaner fueling, and it's not gonna show up so much, because it really is probably from mile like 15, 16 plus on the run in the marathon where this fueling strategy really starts to pay dividends. Deep into it, and obviously you don't quite reach that level of deep fatigue in a half that you do in a full.
Yeah. For the pros, a half distance race these days takes them 3 hours 40 or faster, even if it's a really fast course. So 3 hours 45, 3 hours 50 for a really slow course. So it's not really that long a timeout. So as you say, you would imagine that 90 grams would be plenty, because we can still store quite a bit of muscle glycogen if we have tapered and carb loaded a bit. So
and also,
so just from math perspective, it does add up that you don't really have
works,
to go.
Yeah. And also, although the intensity is high, and by far and away carbohydrates the primary fuel, these people are very fit and very conditioned and are very good at burning fat as well. So there's obviously always a reasonable contribution of fat into that, into the energy. So it's not just rinsing through muscle glycogen, especially if the pace settles in on the bike. If the bike's a bit more steady state, then you can imagine that they're not going to be in a fat burning zone, but the proportion of fat is going to be significant.
Yeah, absolutely. So what about training the gut? You mentioned the interview with, or I thought who I interviewed, and I remember that for the study that he made, the gut training protocol, I think, was 3 weeks. During 3 weeks before the study, the race was the study, they had to consume more than 90 grams of carbs per hour for 3 times per week, and that was kind of their gut training protocol. And then they went on and most of the group with even 120 grams per hour managed to do it without a discomfort. But what is it that you've seen in practice with athletes that have been able to consume really high amounts of carbohydrate that they do to get used to that?
The difficulty we've had on that so far is that it's a relatively new concept, and with the best will in the world, athletes are usually very willing to share their race data and like really think about it in races, but getting them to knuckle down and like record all the numbers accurately and stuff for training sessions repetitively and do it all the time, even though I think it could benefit their performance, is a rare thing. So being transparent with you, I don't think we've got lots and lots of like data to fall back on, but subjectively what we're encouraging athletes to do, and we're trying to get numbers on, is picking 1 or 2 key training sessions in a week. This is within the last sort of 6 weeks building up to the race. And the reason for 6 weeks is simply because it feels like a sensible amount of time to drive some adaptations. We know that a lot of physiological adaptations take days and weeks to kick in. So starting 5 or 6 weeks out, starting with whatever level of carbohydrate they would normally take in those sessions, and just doing a small linear increase in it, up to a point at which either they start to suffer discomfort or just keep it increasing up until the race. So it's honestly at the moment, and I think most people in this space would say the same thing. There's no hard and fast rules, and it's not especially sophisticated. It's essentially going out once or twice a week and really focusing on making sure that you have a little bit more carbohydrate than you had in the same session the week before, thinking about how you feel, thinking about how your GI tract deals with it. And sort of, if your goal is 90 grams in the race and you're currently comfortably doing 60, you've just got to put 5 or 10 grams a week in over a few weeks to get up there. And I don't think it needs to be overcomplicated.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Very, very practical. And it's kind of like, a lot of runners building up for a marathon do it, that their first marathon do it that way, just adding a few kilometers per week to their overall running and their overall long run. And it's simple, but it works. Yeah.
And until someone comes along, and people will study this more and come up with like more exciting protocols and things like that, I think that's how I would advise people who want to have a go with it to approach it. It's like, first of all, establish your baseline, what you think is tolerable and reasonable at the moment, and nudge it upwards. on a weekly basis while figuring out how you feel about it. And I think when you're doing fueling, don't forget to be mindful about the impact of hydration on your fueling, because what you can't do is allow yourself to, go out in the heat and become dehydrated when you're trying to do this, because you'll reduce your blood volume, you reduce blood flow to the gut, and that will hit your fueling in a negative way because you won't absorb as much. So the two have kind of got to go hand in hand.
Yeah, definitely. And that's another point that we'll get onto in a little bit. But before that, though, you mentioned the glucose and fructose ratio of 2-to-1 glucose to fructose, 60 grams per hour of glucose and 30 grams of fructose, having been shown to be an absorbable amount. When we get to these higher amounts beyond 90 grams, what do you think are the trends there? Do people tend to get higher on the glucose or the fructose side? And what does the research say, if anything, about that?
I think whatever people do in that space depends. We can assume that a lot of people are using 2-to-1 glucose fructose products because a lot of them exist. They're quite common in the market. And so my assumption would be that in the majority of cases, people are continuing along the same sort of ratio if they're using gels exclusively or drinks exclusively or whatever to get up. So, and I don't know whether there's been like a really solid theory proposed as to how this, if it's basically like 60 glucose and 30 fructose, like where's the missing 30 grams come from? I would imagine it's like anything with elite athletes, it's that they're or with any group of people, individual ceilings might be just higher than that, because the 60 and the 30 are kind of obviously like averages or middle ground figures, and you're going to get outliers. So I'm not aware of anything like any solid theory as to why you might be able to do more. And honestly, in practical terms, when I talk to some of the nutritionists who work with Pro Tour cyclists and those kind of people who definitely, they're a cohort that definitely know a lot about eating more than 90 grams an hour. A lot of them aren't too worried about the ratios. They're all about the riders self-monitoring, because those guys eat a lot of different foods on the bike and a lot of different drinks and a lot of different things. I think the general trend is when they're trying to smash more in, it becomes more synthetic, if not synthetic, then more processed. Like it's more gels, it's more gooey stuff or liquid stuff, rather than they're not going to start eating pastries or something. But at the same time, I don't get the impression, talking to, like I say, some of the people who are working with riders in the Tour or the World Tour or whatever, that they're counting the type of carbohydrate too heavily. I think what they're just doing is just putting more carbohydrate through in whatever format they're used to using.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And that is what, from personal experience as well, when I've been experimenting with high amounts, it's been what I've been doing, just 2-to-1 ratios, continuing to use that and just go a little bit higher and see how it works. I do think there are some papers that have found that maybe fructose transporters can transport more than 30 grams per hour, but I don't think there's a whole lot of evidence. And if I remember correctly from from Aito's paper about the ultra runners, what they did was simply use a standard 2-to-1 ratio. Although don't quote me on that, I may be wrong.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I remember looking for that information, because when we were looking at making our own energy gels and things, there was some considerable debate around whether to have a 2-to-1 glucose fructose ratio, or whether to stray from that and increase the amount of fructose. And although there was like a sniff of some potential rationale for increasing the fructose, we actually thought, no, at the moment the evidence is still kind of piled in the way that 2-to-1 is worked. It's accepted by people, so go with that.
Yeah. All right. So the next topic then that I want to discuss is the format of the energy products and format. I mean, we have discussed this already a little bit with gels. You said gels are king. One thing, actually, a follow up on that. When you have the athletes that are taking a lot of gels on the bike in a triathlon, would they typically mix it in a bottle and just get a lot of it in that way, or would they actually fill up their pockets or bento boxes on the bike and so on? What's the
Yeah,
how did they do it practically?
I think a lot of them do put them into a water bottle, because although it makes it a little bit harder to meter out the dosage, you kind of just have to do a bit of practicing in your head of like thinking, well, roughly how much of a squeeze, how much of a mouthful is the same as a normal gel, to calibrate, your perception of how much you're having per hour. There's obvious advantages to that, because you're not having to rip a gel open every 15, 20 minutes and deal with the packaging and all that sort of stuff. The downside is it obviously takes a bottle cage up, which could be used for drinks. And in the heat, that might be one of the times when people would consider going back the other way and prioritizing carrying more liquid and having more calories in their pockets, as it were. I think there's still, it's weird, isn't it? There's not people putting energy gels into water bottles, and maybe if they're thick energy gels, having to water them down a little bit. There's still not a great industry elegant solution to all of that. And hopefully at some point there will be. We're certainly looking at, with our precision fuel gels, we will make a 90-gram gel, a single pouch, which contains the equivalent of 3 normal energy gels in the not too distant future, because I think, for one, on the run, that makes a lot of sense, because being able, with a resealable cap, you can carry 1 unit and get three gels down you. But even if you were going to empty those into a bottle on the bike, it's less packaging and less waste and stuff. So that kind of makes sense. So we're going to experiment. We are already experimenting with prototypes of that. We're just trying to refine the packaging at the moment. But I don't think it matters how you do it, as long as you have some kind of handle on how much you're taking in. That's the important thing.
Yeah, no, I think, as you say, the downside, well, yeah, there are a couple of downsides with potentially not having enough or getting as much fluid on board, but that's where using the aid stations becomes important, just even if it's just to get water from the aid stations or an electrolyte drink.
And a lot of tri-bikes will have a drink system up front these days, and potentially a bottle behind the saddle as well. So if you add that along with your down tube bottle, then there's quite a big capacity there.
Yeah, there is. One other interesting topic regarding the format is the trend of using hydrogels, like Morten that you mentioned.
Yeah.
What's your take on hydrogels for energy products?
I think the scientific consensus is definitely coming down along the line of they're definitely no worse than any other type of carbohydrate in terms of absorption and whatnot, but also there is a significant question mark about the claims that they are significantly better. To me, I think as a company, Morten do some fantastic things. I've used their products in races myself, from a performance and a sort of an interest point of view, and they seem really good. But I think a lot of the industry is guilty of just like overblown claims with what's in products. And hydrogels have a plausible scientific basis for why they might be better. But do I believe that they're like an absolute game changer or something like that? Not really. I think that if they were, then you would see much bigger performance differences in the athletes that are using them.
Yeah, I think a great podcast to listen to for those interested in learning about the scientific evidence is Fuel the Pedal. It's a podcast with mostly nutrition topics and related to cycling, and they had 2 British scientists on. That must have been almost a year ago now, but
it was Lewis James. Episode. It was Lewis James, wasn't it? I think, and is it Sam Impey maybe?
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And they said exactly what you say, that scientifically they've been shown to be definitely no worse, but also maybe not better. I do think from a coaching perspective, I've had several athletes use them, and a couple of athletes at least say that they, on an individual case-by-case basis, they can be a game changer. With athletes that have had some GI issues, for some of them, it just seems to work. They seem to work really well, sit well in the stomach. So definitely not to discount them at all, but I think it's more of an individual than a generalizable claim that they can work better.
Yeah, and I think you find that's the case quite often with hydration and nutrition, the same as it is with food and drink in life. You know, people do have their little favourites of what they like, and there's a bit of emotion and sort of placebo effect, if you like, tied up in all of that. And none of that is a bad thing if used to your advantage. If you want to if you can find a product that for whatever reason you really believe will help you, it's far better to use that product than use something else which you have doubts about. Because, you know, for some people, I'm pretty certain that an energy gel that costs, you know, significantly more may for some people result in it feeling like it performs better, because, you know, in the same way that a really expensive suit will make someone feel better at a job interview, you know, because
Yep.
we know that phenomenon is very real with human beings.
Yeah. I'm curious about the GI distress thing, whether that might be a real effect, and if so, if there is something that is different on at the physiology level with those individuals that experience that. Of course, I'm not definitely not disputing that even that could be partially down to placebo, but potentially that there could also be just individual variations that cause it to, for some people, work and reduce the amount of GI distress or eliminate it that they've had with other products.
Yeah, and that really is one of the key things for people to take home with the hydration and nutrition stuff. We always come back to it, but there's always a bit of individualized trial and error that matters a lot. And one of our aims for the future actually is to bring a lot of these case studies that we've got of athletes doing races together on the web, so that people can just read them and read what, you know, Sam Appleton had at Ironman St George on the bike and run, how his performance was and all this shit. Not necessarily with a view to people copying what these people do, but just comparing that with what Emma Pallant does, or what Sarah Crowley does, or with what an age grouper does, so that they can start to get an appreciation of all these different strategies that probably work for different individuals. That hopefully not only gives some parameters for carb intake, fluid intake, salt intake to calibrate thinking, but it also gives a level of reassurance that you've got to find out what works for you and not worry about what other people are doing so much.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I mean, yeah, you have already had Sam Appleton's Daytona data, I think, on your blog, and I always appreciate reading these different case studies. And your Chris at your PH was kind enough to send a lot of case studies that I don't think have been published to me, but it was very nice to just dig into them and just see what different athletes have been doing in different races.
Yeah, one of those actually that we've sent to you is one that we're discussing a lot internally in the business, and I'm sure you wouldn't mind me mentioning it. Is Dougal Allen is an adventure racer and quite a successful Ironman athlete from New Zealand, who has definitely been pushing the upper limits of carbohydrate intake, and he's a big guy and he races very fast, but he's someone that we're really excited to chat to further about, you know, the kind of the gut training and all those sort of things, because he's been quite a big advocate of that for a while. And when you look at some of his race plans, his fueling strategies are really quite aggressive, but they seem to work really well for him. So yeah, there's definitely some interesting case studies out there, and we are on a mission to sort of bring more of them into the public domain.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to another question, and just trying to tie these things together a little bit with the fueling and the hydration and sodium, those three levers that you mentioned. What are your general recommendations when it comes to how to combine them, and are there any things that you should be avoiding when it comes to planning your race nutrition and hydration strategy, so that you still have those three levers to pull and can do that effectively?
Yeah, I guess the place to start is to say that in general, because we talked about this a long time ago, I think the first time you and I spoke, was in general, I still am a believer in the philosophy of largely hydrating with what's in your bottles, and maybe getting your salts and electrolytes in there, and taking calories and carbohydrates from somewhere separate predominantly, in order that you have the flexibility to manipulate the levers separately. Because when you put all of your energy, your electrolytes, your fluids in one bottle, then you run the risk of, if those proportions aren't exactly what you need, if you need more fluid that day, you drink twice as many bottles as you would have done on a cold day, you don't need twice as much energy, and that can be a recipe for GI distress. With that being said, though, the caveat to that is that when races are shorter, sometimes the advantages of having everything in one bottle outweigh the disadvantages. So using like a classic sports drink, carbohydrate, electrolyte, fluid all in one bottle is probably an eminently sensible thing to do in a warmer marathon or in a Olympic distance triathlon on the bike to get a lot of calories in easily or something like that. But I would say, I know that a lot of the people that you coach and listen to this will probably be longer distance athletes. And I would say, try as much as possible, not exclusively, but try as much as possible to separate out your fluids, electrolytes together and your calories separately, because then as you want more calories, you can just have more gels or more chews or more bars. As you want more fluids and electrolytes, you can drink more from your bottles, and you don't have to double dose. The other thing that I would say, and this is something that we've worked really hard to correct with our product range, is like, be really careful you're not kind of double dosing on things by having different products. Like lots of energy gels have quite a bit of sodium in them, but people don't necessarily realize that if it's in the small print on the back. So they work out what sodium they need, and then they're getting an extra 50% of sodium from their energy gels. So all of a sudden they're taking 50% more than their plan called for. Or, the same can be true with, caffeine is something we haven't touched on at all, but that's a classic one where people don't realize there's caffeine in certain products. And that, so what I'm trying to say with that one is, like, really understand what is in each of the products you have, because you might have one brand of gel which has 22 grams of carbohydrate in it, and you might have another brand of gel which has 28 grams of carbohydrate in it. Now, in one gel, that's not a huge difference. But if you're taking like 3 gels an hour, all the same brand, all throughout a 9-hour race, you're not comparing apples with apples there. If you're not, so we've made our energy gels, all of them are bang on 30 grams of carbohydrate. The electrolyte levels in our drinks are either 500 milligrams a litre, 1,000 milligrams a litre, or 1,500 milligrams a litre, so that you can really clearly see what you're putting together. And I think that's, when it comes to that planning and executing process, like understanding what's actually in the products that you're taking is really important.
Yeah. What is the best? You have great resources on your website for helping with planning these things. You have blog posts, and maybe even do you have any spreadsheets? If you would direct people to further read about and learn about these things and look at it in detail in front of their computer, when they can sort of really absorb it and see these things in action, like adding numbers to spreadsheet perhaps, what are the best resources that you have that you would advise people to go to?
Yeah, on our site, if you want a broad introduction to the type of things we've talked about, we've got a blog which is called it's called something like The Way to Fuel and Hydrate for Endurance Performance, and it's sort of subtitled The Three Levers, and we can definitely link to that. I can send you a link to that for the show notes, so people can go in there. That sets the scene and it recaps a lot of what we've talked about, pulling the levers separately. Now, beyond that, we've got a tool on the website at the moment, which is the free hydration plan, where you can put in your details, about your racing, and it will give you an idea of, it will put you in a bucket of low, medium, high, or very high when it comes to fluid and salt requirements. So you can start, and it will give you some parameters around that. And then on the page on the website where we've got our Precision Fuel energy gels, there's a button which says, how much fuel do I need? And that's got something called the quick carb calculator behind it, where you can basically punch in the duration and intensity of the activity you're doing and the mode of exercise, and it will give you that ballpark 30 grams or 30 to 60 grams of carb, 60 grams, 60 to 90 grams of carb, so that you can again start to get a feeling for where your ballpark of energy intake should be. Then beyond that, it's really moving into the space of going, okay, well, if the planner is suggesting that my range of fluid intake might be 500 to 750 mils with 500 milligrams of sodium, and I need 60 grams of carbs, it's then time to hit the streets and give it a try. And at that point, the next course of action from our perspective would be for people to book a free video call with with the team here at PH to kind of discuss how it's going. And that's available through the website as well. You can just book a call in on Zoom, on Google Hangouts with the team and sort of go through things. In the future, we are in development at the moment, is a more comprehensive, complete sort of fueling and hydration planner for events. And that will be on our website in the next few months. But that's a monster project that, like every project that you start, you think that'll be ready very soon. And then you realize it's going to take a few months.
Yeah. At 50% budget and 100% time or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah. No, that's all great information. And just to piggyback on the discussion around those three levers and how to get in the things you need and what to take in a race. So something that I've personally found works reasonably well for half distance races for me is to have one bottle with the gels, getting the energy through that, and then having one bottle with electrolytes and a pretty big bottle at that, and then just relying on water from the aid stations, and then I can get around the course with just two bottles, one of which is integrated in the frame. So it's actually from an aerodynamic perspective as well. That's the other thing, considering aerodynamics as well, and how many bottles you want to carry and where you want to carry them. So
can I ask you actually, Michael, as someone who does this on a regular basis, when you put energy gels in your water bottle, do you add a little bit of water to them, or do you find that they sort of travel through?
I definitely add water. I fill the bottle, so it might be an 800 milliliter bottle. It might be actually 400 milliliters of fluid, and the rest is the gels. So you do get some fluid from that bottle as well. It's not just the energy.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Yeah,
but obviously you can't get the fluid without the energy, as you say. So that's not you don't have the two separate in that sense. But for that, I have the electrolyte bottle, and then relying on aid stations for additional water.
Yeah, it makes sense.
All right. So I do have one more question, and this is one that I got in from a listener a few weeks ago, and it's an interesting one. So I'm just going to read it from my second screen here, and that is. This listener writes, I'm hoping you can solve what I've come to refer to as the sweat mystery. If you can only absorb about 1 liter of fluid per hour, but have a sweat rate of, say, 2 liters per hour, how is it possible to finish a race that lasts over 9 hours without experiencing severe dehydration? Perhaps we can tackle that part first, and then there are some other parts to this question.
So it's a very good question, and I think what's the best way to start on that one? So when we talk about athletes having a sweat rate of, for example, 2 liters an hour, or an absorption rate of 1 liter an hour, and those are obviously really nice round figures to make the maths easy for this example. The reality is that even if you measure your sweat rate at race intensity, even over several hours in a training session or something like that, you're only ever going to come up with an approximate figure. And if you measure your sweat rate for an hour, you'll get an hourly figure. But if you then do 3 hours, and it's about 3 times that figure, but not quite, or it's a little bit more or less, did you sweat the same in the first hour, but then a little bit less or a little bit more in the second hour and third hour with the environment? There's a lot of variables that push those numbers around. So simply banging the numbers into a spreadsheet and going 2 liters an hour is my rate over 9 hours, that equals 18 liters of sweat loss. There's a big margin of error in that number, is what I would say. First off, I would say there's also a big margin of error in the we can only absorb 1 liter an hour, because that is definitely in the correct ballpark. But if that's only 800 milliliters, or if that's actually 1250 milliliters, there's also a big margin of error comes into it. So the other thing to remember is that in terms of like most people will and should finish an Ironman dehydrated to an extent. We know that when you look at the numbers, anyone who finishes having gained body weight is usually not in a good way. It means they've overconsumed mainly fluid and are quite possibly hyponatremic. If we know that a lot of the faster finishers tend to lose anywhere up to 5, 6, 7% of their body weight, although I think for the average finisher, it's probably more prudent to be in or more common to be in the sort of 2 to 4% dehydration range. So we know there's a bit of a leeway there. And what accounts for those other missing numbers is probably a lot down to the body being incredibly good at self-regulation over a period of time. So when you're doing an endurance event, the main thing that drives how much you sweat is a combination of the exercise intensity, which is under your control, conscious and subconscious control, and the environmental temperature. And that drives your sweat rate, because you have to sweat X amount to cool your core temperature to stop you from overheating. Now, when you start out, you might be sweating on the bike at 2 liters an hour early in the ride because you're pushing 250 watts and it's quite hot. But as you start to dehydrate, one thing we know is that dehydration, especially when it gets more severe, results in a blunting of sweat rate. So because you get less blood flow to the skin, you get less, and your blood volume drops, you get less blood available to be, because sweat comes from blood plasma, so your sweat rate decreases. Now, if your sweat rate decreases and your core body temperature is going up, you're going to slow down a little bit as a result, which is going to, because the body is like adjusting all these levers to not lose too much fluid, so you don't overheat too much, so you don't end up in a heap on the floor. Plus, it's going to drive you to be thirsty, to consume a little bit more, and maybe even, and there is no solid proof on this point, but I've seen it with athletes who have very high sweat rates. At times when some athletes are losing huge amounts of fluid, it does appear that they can absorb huge amounts of fluid as well. I have seen riders in the Tour drinking 3 bottles an hour in for short periods of time, which is like 1.5 liters. Now, you can't say for sure whether they're absorbing that, but they must be absorbing most of it, because they're not stopping and peeing the whole time. So I would say that question is a really good one, because when you do look at the maths in a simplistic way, they don't add up. But the body in that environment, and all of those variables come together so that things are a little bit more finely tuned. And obviously, when they do go catastrophically wrong, when you do become really dehydrated, you can't maintain the intensity, so the sweat rate's going to drop off. So everything kind of is homeostasis. Everything comes to a level. And when you look at that data that's been produced on Ironman finishes, and everyone's clustered in that, or the majority of people are clustered in that sort of like a few percent of dehydration, we can see that that's what the body can cope with. Somebody's a little bit more, somebody's a little bit less, but that's kind of in the ballpark. And so it's a bunch of like assumptions and rounding errors that can be punched into a spreadsheet but don't add up in the real world. Have I made sense with that?
Absolutely, yeah, total sense, and it sounds completely reasonable to me. Good answer. Then the other part of the question is that, let me see here, so I can find it. If heat acclimation makes you sweat more, wouldn't doing a heat acclimation protocol ahead of a hot race make this picture even bleaker? Because, well, then the assumption would be that you would lose even more fluid to sweat without perhaps being able to take on more. But whether those assumptions are correct or not, what are your comments on that?
Yeah, it's a totally fair question. If you look at it one dimensionally, if you say that like sweat loss is bad because you lose more fluid, then, but what the body did, the reason the body up regulates your sweating response when you're heat acclimated is because the priority is cooling down. So you need to reduce core body temperature, and the most effective way to shed heat from the body is to evaporate water off the skin and sweat off the skin, so you sweat more. So feasibly, what it means is that you are going to have to drink more. Whether the body can and will upregulate the amount of fluid you can absorb is TBD, but the concept that your sweat rate will allow you to maintain a higher metabolic output means that you'll race faster. So it's one of those which is a trade-off. And as you sweat more quickly, you become thirsty more quickly, so you will drink more. And as we know, on many physiological systems, that doing an Ironman or a half Ironman or whatever, especially in the heat, involves like treading a really fine line across all of these things. And so it just means that the goalposts in that dimension have moved. But I think when you really zoom out and say, and I'm not saying this person's asking a facetious question, I'm sure they're not, but honestly, like, would you just go to Hawaii without doing any heat acclimation because you thought it would make you race faster? I can't imagine many athletes putting their hand up and saying, oh yeah, no, I'd come straight from the cold to the heat. Even if we don't understand entirely all of the reasons why, intuitively and through practical experience and lots of other evidence, we know that heat acclimation overall is a massive benefit to racing in the heat, so should always be done if you can.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's all for the main topics that I had. Do you just quickly want to mention as well, you have said that you have your precision fuel range coming up as well, but we haven't officially talked about it. So can you just quickly describe what that is for the listeners that may not be aware?
So we've just launched Precision Fuel alongside Precision Hydration. It's kind of to do the same for fueling as we've done for hydration, which is educate and make the numbers around what you need to take in really transparent and easy to hit. So we've got this quick carb calculator on our website, so you can figure out based on your mode of exercise, the intensity and duration, roughly how much carbohydrate you need. And then the first two products that we've got in the Precision Fuel range are a 30 grams of carb energy gel and a 30 grams of carbohydrate per 500 ml drink, which also has 500 milligrams of sodium per serving as well. So they're the first two. We've also got an energy chew coming out in the forthcoming months as well. So they're available as we record on pre-order, and probably by the time this is live for order on precisionhydration.com. And there's a number of blogs around fueling, and not necessarily just how to use our products, but how to fuel in general, which are worth looking up in the blog section of the website as well.
Yeah. All right. So I do want to ask the rapid fire questions of you as well. We did them the first time you were on, but that was some years ago now. So let's see. I don't remember what you answered back then, but let's go through them. And the first one is, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to endurance sport?
So I reckon this is a more of a slightly off the wall one, but there's a blog that I've been reading. So a guy called Gordo Byrne, who is a triathlete and a triathlon coach quite a few years ago now, has a blog now, and he's retired as an athlete, and as he's a dad, same as I am. He's a little bit older than me. He still keeps fit and active, but I read his blog on a regular basis because it's a really interesting take on a guy who's navigating fatherhood, staying fit after competition, after retiring from triathlon and that kind of thing. And I'll shoot you a link to that blog, because we for PH we reached out to Gordo and asked him a bunch of questions during the pandemic, because I was reading his blog. He was blogging pretty much daily during the pandemic, and it was really good. And I would just say, if you want a different perspective on lots of aspects of life, especially around aging athletes and that kind of thing, he's a fantastic follow. So really good resource, and something I'm quite into at the moment.
Yeah, that's great. I think a couple of guests have mentioned his blog before, but from the time when he was actively racing, and I actually thought that he had retired from blogging and writing about this stuff as well. So it's really cool to hear that he's still actively doing it.
Yeah, I can highly recommend his stuff. He's got a good opinion on most things.
Yeah. Next, what's your favorite piece of gear or equipment?
At the moment, it's and no sponsorship or other endorsement involved. It's my Cervelo Aspiro gravel bike, because the sun's shining and I'm out there on a weekend putting the miles in and really enjoying it.
That sounds fantastic. And what's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
I've got lots of bad personal habits that people don't want to copy, and probably the one that has helped me over the years is being an early riser and getting up early and getting things done first thing in the morning, because I've usually achieved quite a lot before 9 a.m. And I think if you can do that in your life, then the day throws a lot of things at you, but you've got control first thing in the morning quite often. So get the important stuff done early. If it's training, if it's writing a blog, if it's whatever, that's probably it's something I find helpful anyway.
Right. And finally, where can listeners follow you on social media? Of course, we have precisionhydration.com for the company website and Precision Hydration social media profiles. Do you have any personal outlets?
I am on social platforms, but not particularly active. Probably the best place is to follow. Like I write quite a bit, and usually that's for the Precision Hydration blog. So that is honestly probably the best place to follow. Yep. And if people have got questions to direct to me personally or the company, we're a small team still, and they all come in through hello@precisionhydration.com, and we always happy to hear from people with questions and stuff. So feel free to reach out and get in touch.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Andy, for coming on and taking the time. It was great, as always, to talk to you.
Yeah, lovely to chat, Michael, and hopefully won't be too long before we can do it again.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Andy. As always, you can find the show notes for the episode on scientifictriathlon.com, where we'll link to several articles, one at least by Andy and others by Abby Coleman, the sports scientist at Precision Hydration, on the topics that we discussed today, including how much carbohydrate to consume per hour, whether it's possible to consume more than 90 grams per hour, whether you can train your gut to do that, and whether the type of carb in your energy products really matters, as well as the resources that I mentioned before, the quick carb calculator and the link to book a free consultation with Precision Hydration. Do make use of that if you want to. It's a free call, no strings attached, and you can get feedback on your or tips for your race nutrition and hydration strategy. We'll have another episode out next Monday, just for those of you that didn't hear it last week. But for now, I'm taking a bit of a break from the Thursday episodes, but I'll keep having episodes out every single Monday. Probably it will be a mix of interviews, but some solo episodes as well, because I do know that a lot of people like those solo episodes that we've been doing in the TTS Thursday kind of style. So I'll try to keep doing those as well. If you're interested in coaching or training plans, go and check out scientifictriathlon.com and what we have to offer there. We would love to help you achieve your race goals. And finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Improve your race nutrition and hydration plan by using their free hydration plan or their quick carb calculator, or by getting a free video call with their experts, and get 15% off your order with the promo code THATTriathlonshow15. And thank you to Roka, that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swim skins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses, and get 20% off your order with the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.